or to a service, not giving looks at people for making too much noise or having a fussy baby or sitting in your pew.
Ooh.
And it's not judging someone because of what they wear to church. It's not assuming that you know what their life must be like. Truth be told, I received more messages this week about what hospitality is not than what it is, which concerns me. It makes me think those people have had more experiences with inhospitable communities, not just churches, but experiences in the world. Even this week, one of the books I've been reading gives examples of what hospitality is not. One book tells a tale of one church, and it talks about how this lady tried to take a visitor's fussy baby away from her. The woman did it with all good intentions, thinking that she was being hospitable to the guests, allowing her to enjoy the service and care for her baby in the nursery. However, the visitor perceived this as a threat because she was from a culture where you don't take your children away from the parents. She was from a culture where it was okay for a baby to cry in church. So what she understood that day was that her baby's presence was not wanted and that she was unwelcome. Needless to say, that visitor left the church and never returned. Perhaps what this story is a reminder of is that sometimes we engage in things that we try to do as acts of hospitality, but are actually perceived as harm. So in all the things that we do, we're to try to live by Wesley's 3 simple rules: to do good, to do no harm, and to stay in love with God. And this remains true as we strive to be radically hospitable to our community. We must ask ourselves, is what we're trying to do going to cause harm? There were so many stories that I wish I could share with you this week about hospitality, about what it is and what it is not. However, I did find one common theme among many stories, and they were all experiences related back to communion. And it wasn't just in the stories that friends sent me, but our Bible study this week sort of hit on the note that communion is about radical hospitality. In the United Methodist tradition, we serve grape juice instead of wine. We do it as a sign of a social witness. We do it as a way of extending radical hospitality. We use juice so that anyone who suffers from the disease of alcoholism or is tempted by drinking doesn't have to feel isolated from participating in communion. They will never have to struggle or make that choice. Using juice as a social witness, though, is not the only thing hospitable about communion. Communion itself is radically hospitable. Communion is a place where the love and welcome of Christ is extended to all people. And I wish I could have shared some of those powerful stories about communion with you, but I could only pick one. And perhaps selfishly so, I picked one that has had an impact on my life. See, I was traveling with a group of students in El Salvador, living among a community of people that had dire effects from the Civil War. And by living among the people, I mean we were not staying in a hotel. There was no hotel near us. We were camping and living where a lot of people just live in pretty much trash put together made huts along the river. The river that they bathed in was the same river that we took our baths in. It's the same river that they wash their clothes in, or every week. And it's the same river that those people would probably get to cook their food in. And we would eat among them, and I'm sure our food was probably cooked with some of that water. The only difference was we carried in bottled water to drink because the water was so unsafe for us to drink that we wouldn't have been able to stay there at all. It also meant that we walked from place to place as long as it was close. And occasionally, being spoiled Americans, we would get in a bus. But if you've ever traveled with people or had to go to a place you didn't really like, you know that when you're with people that you don't know very well, in a place that's unfamiliar, in a place that has strange food, strange hours, and it's hot, this group of friends you're with soon becomes a group of enemies. And this group had hit the point where they wanted just to go home, and they were doing nothing but complaining about having to walk to church. But one day they had off from class. So the instructor reluctantly worked with our tour guide and got a bus and a minivan to take the students across the bumpy, dirt, unpaved roads in El Salvador. And on the way to church that morning, we passed people dressed in their best clothing, walking with all of their families, animals in tow, because most of them were coming from such far places that it wasn't safe to leave their animals behind, carrying all the water and food necessary not only for their families but for their animals. I think you can get the picture here. It was like caravans of people. They had to plan to take what they needed for the journey to go to church. See, it was so rural that they weren't accustomed to having a priest in town. It was a rarity to get a priest to come. So when the word was out, the priest is coming, you did what you had to do to bring everything you had and get to church. We personally didn't have to travel that far, and yet we were too good that day to walk. We thought we had learned our lesson by riding the car. That wasn't until our professor ordered the car to stop and invited a lady carrying this newborn child into our van. We took her to church, which is where she was headed, and we assumed that was our lesson learned. However, when we arrived to the church, we realized that was only the beginning for us. We noticed that the service had started and that there was a large crowd gathered outside the front doors. They quickly turned their attention from the inside of the church out to our van. And being self-centered Americans, our first thought was, oh, they're just looking at us because we're foreigners. Perhaps they haven't seen Americans before. Probably asking themselves, what are we doing here? But instead, they were working among themselves to figure out a way to get this group of Americans into their church, to hear the priest share the good news. A group of men that day exited the wall and let our group come in. They remained outside the entire service in hopes to hear what little bit they could, knowing that going outside those doors meant they would not receive communion that day. We, a group of non-Catholic Americans, entered the church humbled. We participated in a worship service with people from all over that region, with animals wandering around us, and we, most importantly, that day had an encounter with Christ. We received hospitality like that Christ modeled in his life and ministry. I'll never forget the sacrifice those men made. Not only did they give up their opportunity to have communion with the priest that day, but who knows how many times after that they would not be able to gain access to communion, because the men in that region had to travel for work, and it was the beginning of the migration season. So then we were guaranteed communion for at least another year. Who knows if the priest was even going to come back to town. They sacrificed, my friends, for strangers in a foreign land. They extended an invitation. They were radical. They were hospitable. They changed my life. They changed the life of all those students on that bus. They changed my story. They changed my witness to the world. So I want to ask you again, have you ever had an experience with radical hospitality?
Not like that.
Have you ever had a chance to be transformed by the love of Christ? Radical hospitality is the business of fruitful congregations and individuals. Radical hospitality is done in many ways. By preparing your building for visitors, by having signs or maps, or having user-friendly bulletins. How about utilizing your space well, caring for the physical structure of a building? Or as the United Methodist Women, here it is, are doing, they're creating invitations to personally invite all the women in the church to attend the next United Methodist Women meeting. So be sure today on your way out that you get an invitation. My friends, radical hospitality is also about providing invitations to experience Christ and Christ's welcome to all people. Going beyond the invitations, we find ways to offer opportunities to develop and foster a relationship with Jesus the Christ. We create a place where the community knows what we do for the kingdom of God makes a difference. We create a place that if it disappeared overnight would be all over the headlines. It would be greatly missed. We create a place that people are willing to leave the distractions of the world behind and come to worship because they know that there's something of value here. They will find a place where their life, their concerns, hopes, dreams, fears will all matter. They'll find the place that Paul, according to one scholar I read this week, challenged the community in Romans to provide a place where those who are strong must help those through their own current state of powerlessness have these weaknesses. They must support and encourage them, not browbeat them or ask them to do things they don't have the strength